Hello friends, and welcome once again to this edition of a Walk in the Garden Bible study. And this is part 9 in our study of Genesis chapter 1. And if you were with us for our last lesson, you remember we were studying day 3 of creation, day 3 of God's creative acts. And so thus far on day 3 of God's creation, we have seen the separation of the waters. The great massive amounts of water that were covering the globe at that time, God has chosen to separate those to create the great basins that would contain them, to provide for their boundaries. And by doing that, we see for the very first time the emergence of dry land. And so we see the raising of the continents in the fact that dry land is appearing for the very first time. And so now we're going to see the adornment of the dry land, and we're going to see for the very first time the introduction of life. You know, up to this point, God has been preparing the habitation place for life to be introduced. And we've seen the creation of the atmosphere, we've seen the creation of light, and we've seen the creation of the great bodies of water. And so all of these things have been formulated and put in place in an effort to provide a sustainable living place for living organisms. And so today we're going to see the very first introduction of life in the form of vegetation. And we're going to pick that up in Genesis chapter 1 and verses 11. Begin with verse 11. And we see the Bible says, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day." So a couple things that we'll notice is that, when mankind is confronted with the evidences of creation, when he's confronted with the stars in the sky and the sun and the moon and all of the manifold witnesses of God that surround us each and every day through his creation, there's only one of two choices that can be made. The first choice is to accept these evidences as God's account that he's given to us of creative acts, that the fact that God has created all these things that we observe. The second choice that can be made is to deny God's account of creation and to try to take all of these evidences that surround us and try to work backwards in trying to formulate a plan that would go all the way back to whatever the origination is going to be. And unfortunately, that's a faulty plan. And so that's what a lot of folks have chosen to do. That instead of looking at God's account, where he's taken it from the beginning and the initiation and worked outwardly, they've tried to take all of these evidences and work from outwardly and go back inwardly and try to arrive at a conclusion of an origination point. And of course, that's truly an impossible situation, because they can never, ever look back in the annals of time and see, any other alternative to the beginning. But we have to make one of those two choices. You can't have both. And there are some groups today that's trying to combine the two and try to say, well, we're going to try to go backwards and see how things developed, but yet somehow tie it into God's account of creation. And so we have to deal with that. And a lot of folks are just misguided and misled and going down a path of an impossibility. And as such, they're just wasting a lot of valuable time in studying something that's just not there. But there's 4 observations basically we can see as we begin the study of these verses today. And the first observation is that we'll notice here that all vegetation began as themselves. The Bible says, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb, the fruit tree," and so all of these plants were designed, not only designed, but implemented as themselves. In other words, they didn't start out as something else and turn into that fruit tree. They didn't start out as an amoeba somewhere in a primeval pool and eventually raise itself up, and at some point one decided he's going to become a blade of grass, and another one decided he's going to go in this direction, become a living animal, and then somewhere along the way that grass says, well, I don't want to be grass anymore, I want to turn into a tree. No, that's just totally idiotic and ridiculousness as it sounds. But the truth of the matter is that God created and designed all plants in their original condition, and not only as themselves, but as a mature, growing, living thing. And so the second observation we're going to see here is that the varieties were established by God. So, the varieties, once again, didn't just get established through eons of time. They were established from the very beginning. God said, I'm going to make a fruit tree here. This is going to be an apple tree. I'm going to make a fruit tree here. This is going to be a pear tree. And not only that, but so that they'll continue as a pear tree and an apple tree, I'm going to put a seed within them. And guess what? That seed is going to replicate, is going to duplicate the exact tree after his kind. It's going to be the same identical plant. And then that one's going to grow up. So we've got a process of growing, maturing, and reproducing. That's the cycle that God has designed. And meanwhile, as these plants are growing and maturing, they provide for other means. Some of them provide shade, some of them provide food for other animals and insects, and some of them will make it to maturity and they'll reproduce. And even the seeds, can provide food for a lot of different animals. But he provided just the right amount of seed in each plant to grow the right amount of plants so they won't overtake the other plants. They'll share the things with the other plants, the land and the atmosphere and the moisture and things around them. But some of them will have enough seeds that if some of those seeds disappear or get ate or whatever the case may be, there's still going to be enough left over to provide continuance. Because we're going to see that God says, be fruitful and multiply to mankind. Well, he's also said, be fruitful and multiply to the entire planet full of vegetation. And he says that by giving this command, this mandate, to come forth, to sprout, to grow. Let the earth bring forth. And when God gives a command, it's going to be fulfilled. It's going to be carried out. And so he gives that mandate for things to grow. So we see that the varieties were initially established by God. The third observation here is that all of these plants were endowed with the means to reproduce. We see here where he says, "Let whose seed is in itself, whose seed is in itself," so that it will reproduce. It has the means to reproduce, and that it's going to reproduce after his kind. So it's not going to turn into something else. It's not going to eventually become something else. It's going to continue. A pear tree is going to continue to be a pear tree. Is going to continue to be a pear tree. And that's the way it's been through the centuries. We observe the same fruits that we enjoy today are the same fruits and herbs that they enjoyed 2,000, 4,000 years ago. Now, granted, mankind has come up with different methods of maybe doing hybrids and putting, trying to morph some things together. But guess what? There's still, corn is still corn. It may be a different variety or a different, maybe have a little bigger kernel than some previous species did, or maybe it's got more rows of corn, or it's got a yellower tint than white tint, or whatever the case may be. But the point being is it's still corn. And we can make hybrid models. We can take this type of corn and crossbreed it with this type of corn, just like we do with dogs and cats and everything else. But the point is they still remain in their species. They still reproduce after their kind. And so God gives them the power to reproduce so that they can continue. God has willed things to replenish the earth and to keep replicating and to be in a self-sustaining environment. And that's the way God has established it. And then the fourth observation is that they would reproduce after their own kind. So I think we've already said enough about that. But a lot of folks have called the vegetation of the earth, they call it the skin of the earth, because it literally wraps the earth, it adorns the earth in all manner of vegetation. I mean, it's incredible how many varieties there are. I mean, God could have just made one variety. He could have made just two varieties. And just everywhere you go, you would observe the same things. But no, He's a God of variety, and He has created, I think they've estimated over 300,000 species of plants alone. And that's not even including all of the subspecies or the offshoots of those. There's over 9,000 types of grasses. So God didn't just say, well, I'm going to make the bluegrass, or I'm going to make the crabgrass, or whatever. He made 9,000 different kinds. And of course, as we saw last time, a lot of these are designed to grow in certain climate conditions, certain types of soil, and certain environments only, to where they're just not going to be able to sustain themselves in the wrong kind of environment. That's where they're designed to be. Now, granted, we can make some adjustments to certain conditions, whether it be in the soil or whether, as long as the climate will be agreeable, and sometimes we can bring plants from other parts of the earth and still get them to grow. But a lot of times, by introducing that type of plant in that area where it's not originally from, then it's going to have an impact. It's going to affect other plants, it's going to affect animal life, it's going to affect the soil, it's going to affect a lot of things, because it was not designed to be in that environment. And so whenever we try to introduce something from the outside of its natural environment, then we usually run into some kind of problem circumstances. But we see that the Bible tells us here that God has created all manner of vegetation, all manner of fruit tree, all manner of herb, all manner of plant life, and He's provided them with a way to reproduce after their own kind, after themselves. And so we see that God said the evening and the morning were the third day. And notice also that after He develops the plant life, He says that it was good. It was perfect in every way, in every form and fashion. And we also notice here that when God says, let the earth bring forth, He's given the mandate, the command for vegetation to grow and to sprout and to mature and to reproduce. And the desire there is so strong that we see it all the time. I've seen where a single blade of grass will push up through the asphalt and actually cause it to crack, and actually cause a chunk of the asphalt to break up and to break away, so that it can cut through there and grow, because it's underneath, it's been covered up, but it still has that nature that God gave it, the command within itself that it's supposed to grow, it's supposed to sprout, it's supposed to mature. And its desire is so strong that even if it's covered up by a rock or a piece of asphalt, it's going to do its best to fulfill that command that God gave it. And so we see that everywhere. We see in the jungles how all the plants will be fighting each other to get to that sunlight. We'll be fighting, we see the vines that grow up the trees. We see the trees that try to get taller than the other trees around it. And everything is just fighting and trying to fulfill its role that God has given it. It's in its DNA. God gave them the instructions, and so they're just trying to follow through on that, and that's what they do. But the other thing we notice here is that the seed is in itself. And God has made many different ways for these seeds to be dispersed. Some of them, the fruit falls to the ground, the outside fruit will get eaten up or will decay, and that seed will eventually find a resting place in the soil. Other ways is that birds will carry off the fruit, or maybe animals will eat the fruit, and they can disperse seeds by maybe dropping them in different areas. They may carry the fruit away from the tree, carry it in a different area, be eating it, drop some of those seeds, and now you've got the seeds planted in that area. Or through excrement. A lot of times the seeds don't get digested and they come out through excrement, and that's another great way of dispersal. Some seeds have trees have little wings on them, to where when they break away from the tree, the wind will catch them and it'll act like a helicopter and disperse that way. So anyway, what I'm saying is there's many ways of the plan of dispersal, And that kind of ties in with also how God has developed the manner for dispersing the gospel message of Christ, of Jesus Christ. Over in Matthew chapter 13 and verses 3 through 9, Jesus gave the disciples a parable there, and he says, "Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth. And forthwith they sprung up, but because they had no deepness of earth, and when the sun was up, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, and some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear." So here, Jesus was talking about the dispersal of the gospel, and he refers it to the dispersal of seeds, because isn't that the way the seeds are dispersed? Some of them fall on a stony ground, they get burned up, they don't grow. Some of them fall in just places where there's not very good earth. They'll spring up, but when they get big, they're not allowed to mature fully because they can't take good root. But out of all those seeds, there's always going to be some that are going to find that fertile soil and grow. So Jesus was comparing that with the gospel message. When we sow the seed of the gospel, when we tell somebody about salvation and about how they can be saved through believing on the Lord Jesus Christ, those are sowing seeds. And we may not always see the results of it, we may not always see the maturity of it or the fruit of it, but if we're just called to be sowers, we're called to just plant that seed and let God do the water, or let somebody else do the watering, but God will eventually get the increase. And so that's the way we do it. And sometimes it may fall on deaf ears, it might fall on that stony heart or that stony ground. Some of it, somebody might take it in, but they just don't have anything in there for it to take root in. But there's going to be some that have that fertile heart, that yearning heart, that heart that really wants to know the truth. And when the seed falls on that heart, and maybe somebody else does have to come along and water it a little bit, but God is going to get the increase, and those people are going to become the children of God. They're going to accept that gospel message. And we see some of the results of that, just to kind of play off on that, over in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 17, verses 32 and 34, here's where Paul was over in Athens, and he was waiting on the other disciples, and he had been telling them the gospel message, and because he saw that the city was wholly turned over to idolatry. And so we see the reaction of the people that were listening to the gospel message here in verse 32 of Acts chapter 17. "And when they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, We will hear thee again of this matter. So Paul departed from among them. Howbeit certain men clave unto him, and believed," and then it gives the names of some of the ones that believed. So we see the three classic reactions to the gospel message. But here was Paul. He saw an opportunity to plant the seed of the gospel. Paul and the disciples were great dispersers of the gospel seed. And isn't that really what we're called as Christians today to do, is to be dispersers of the gospel message, to be dispersers. Think of yourself as Johnny Appleseed out throwing those seeds wherever you go. And that's all we're called to do, is just to plant the seed. We can't always see the direct fruit of it. Sometimes we may, but we can't always expect that. But what we are expected to do is to be sowers. We're called to be sowers of the seed. And so we see here that when these folks had heard of the resurrection of Christ, that was a hard thing for them to retain. That was a hard thing for them to grasp, because they'd been so indoctrinated with these false religions. And so we see the three classic results, which are the same results we're going to get today if we're out sowing the seed of the gospel. Some are going to mock. Some are going to make fun. Some are going to downplay it and just act like it's just a big joke and just basically blow it off. Some are going to be the procrastinators. They're going to say, well, we'll think about it. We'll give it some thought, and we'll think about it, and we'll get back to you later on that. Maybe you'll see us in church this Sunday, or maybe I'll show up next week. And maybe let me get your phone number. I might give you a call. And then, but there's that third group that has the fertile heart. That is the ones that are, and we don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. So that's why we have to disperse the seed wherever we go, because we don't know who's got that stony heart, who's got the shallow heart, or who's got the fertile heart. We just don't know. But howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed and got saved. And then it says, among the which was Dionysus and the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. So there's always going to be fruit result. God promises that His word will not return void, that if we just do our part and sow it, that there will be fruit, and there will be much fruit. But the only way we can have much fruit is to sow much seed. So anyway, we see the dispersal of the seeds here, and we see the completion of day 3 of creation. And what a day it was. And so we've got a few more minutes, so I think we'll go ahead and begin with our look at day 4 of creation, day 4 of God's creative acts. And we see here in verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So, consider this, those that talk about natural selection, those that talk about how things just kind of developed on their own and decided to do what they do and decided to develop into what they unwittingly, when they talk about natural selection, they always personify the elements that they're talking about. You think about, they say, well, nature sure is good, or nature sure is showing her splendor today. Well, they personified this term called nature. They've turned an abstract term into a personage. Now they've assigned it an identity. And so basically you might as well put that first term on there, Mother Nature, such as was worshipped in times past by the Indians, by different tribes and different groups of people, because that's basically what you've done, is you've created a religion with a head of nature, and this nature you're giving credence to, and basically saying that everything was created and guided by this term called nature. And that's what they do. They personify these ambiguous terms by using terms such as operate on, or choose, or favors. They'll say nature favors this one over this one, or evolution. Sometimes they attribute it to evolution, like evolution's a person. Well, evolution has done this. Well, evolution has done that. Evolution has favored this animal over that animal. Evolution's provided for this or selected this. And so, what are they doing? They're realizing that there still has to be an intelligent designer and instructor, but they just refuse to attribute it to the true Creator God. And by doing such, they come out with these ambiguous terms and personify them, and somehow just comes out with an abstract idea that this, but none of them really, when you think about it, ever attribute anything to unguided nature. They always realize that there has to be some guidance, some action, some form of intelligence, and whether they want to admit it or not, they are ascribing those actions to a personified being. But they just refuse to admit that it's God. That's the whole thing behind it. So I just wanted to throw that out there about this, these people that talk about this natural selection. Well, when they say natural selection, well, who is selecting? They say nature is. Well, okay, who's nature? Again, they're identifying it has to be attributed to somebody, but they're just going about it in an ambiguous way in order to try to deny the existence of God. That's all it is. But here we see that God, on the 4th day of creation, is finally dealing with the introduction of the solar system as we know it. And we know the solar system, we call it that because everything revolves around the sun. You know, there was a time in our past when they used to think the earth was the center of all things. And, there's nothing wrong with thinking that way, but we know now that after much studying, and we've got better telescopes and we've got better ways of just, evaluating things, that the sun is literally the center of our solar system. Everything revolves around the sun. And of course, they'll try to figure that out. They'll try to say, well, it's the gravity of the sun that attracts things and keeps them turning and keeps them rotating around. Or they'll say that it's, because the earth is surrounded by a magnetic field. That's why they call it the North Pole and the South Pole. And they don't really understand these magnetic fields, exactly what all they do. But one thing they do is they're in concert with the rotation of the earth. And they're in concert with keeping things in motion, but they're also in concert with protecting the earth with a band, with a shield of magnetism. And so we've got this great magnetic bands that transverse the earth. And that's why you can use a compass and you can get north and south and get east and west on your compass, because they're attracted by the magnetic pulses of these magnetic bands that surround the globe. But we see here that God is going to now deal with the introduction of the solar system, and as such, we see in verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the earth from, or the day from the night. And he says, let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And so the lights in the heaven, before this time we saw that God had created light and divided the light from the darkness, but now he is going to place holders of the light in position and condense the light and consolidate the light into certain entities that he's going to put in the heavens. And the two primary entities that we're concerned with as inhabitants of the earth is the sun and the moon. And he's divided the earth in half, you might say, day from night. And he's divided the light from the darkness and provided a bright light for the day and a subdued light for the darkness. And we know that. That's basic truths. But we see here that the very first initiation of that, the earth had never experienced this up until this point. Even, as we said last time, the vegetation was introduced before the sun, which throws the evolutionist theory out the window. You can't have both. The evolutionist theory says the sun had to be created first in order to induce all things to begin on earth. But God says, not so. I created the seas, I created the atmosphere, and I created the vegetation. Now I'm going to introduce the solar system. And so it's amazing. God places the moon on one position to where it'll be there at night so that we don't have complete and utter darkness. I mean, you think about it, yes, we got artificial lights, but if it wasn't for the moon at night, it would be utter darkness and you wouldn't be able to see anything at all. So God provides the moon there, provides the different phases of the moon, because these things were not only placed there for lights, but as the scripture tells us here, they're there for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And we know that men through the ages have plotted the generations, have plotted the years and so forth, and the different solstices, you might say, and the different phases of the moon, and so they were able to use these as signs and as big, just gigantic time-keeping pieces. This is the way that God implemented time to begin and time to be maintained for the earth, was through the planets that he was going to put in place. And so we see the major holders of the light, the sun and the moon. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about these lights, these great lights that God has created in our next lesson. We'll continue with day 4 of creation. And I hope you'll stay with us for that. We'll see you very soon, and I hope you're having a great day. See you next time.